The water level of Lake Superior is not receding. It is not evaporating. It is not falling due to a seasonal drought or a lack of snowpack in the surrounding watershed of the Upper Peninsula or the Minnesota Arrowhead. Right now, as you watch this, Lake Superior is draining. It is bleeding out through a subterranean tunnel system beneath the floor of the world's largest freshwater lake, a geological void so vast and so deep that no survey in 150 years of modern American science ever detected it. We are talking about 4.7 million gallons of fresh water disappearing every single hour into a lightless abyss. When the first researchers saw the initial sonar returns from the Central Basin, they refused to file their reports. They didn't think they had discovered a geological anomaly. They assumed the multi-beam sensors were shattered by the pressure. They were wrong. The equipment was perfect. What is happening right now beneath the surface of Superior is a nightmare of geophysical proportions, forcing the US Geological Survey and NOAA to rewrite everything they thought they understood about the tectonic stability of the North American craton. Hi, my name is Daniel, and this is Natural Disasters. The numbers that started the panic began to tick upward on March 4, 2026 at 6:47 in the morning Central Standard Time. A routine NOAA water level monitoring station at Marquette, Michigan, registered a reading that the automated system flagged as a critical error. The data showed the lake surface had dropped 1.3 centimeters overnight. To a casual observer, 1.3 centimeters sounds like a rounding error. It is not. Lake Superior's surface area covers 31,700 square miles. To drop the entire surface of that inland sea by 1.3 centimeters in less than 12 hours represents a volume of water so staggering that the NOAA technician on duty, a 12-year veteran named Carol Simmons, ran the calculation 3 times before she dared to pick up the phone. She wasn't looking at a minor fluctuation. She was looking at the overnight disappearance of approximately 113 billion gallons of water. That number, 113 billion gallons, is the equivalent of emptying the entire water supply of a major American city in a single night. This wasn't the 4.7 million gallons per hour rate that would later become the baseline for the crisis. That number would come after the drainage stabilized into a steady, terrifying flow. But this initial drop was the catalyst for a cascade of emergency investigations that would lead 11 days later to a discovery that currently has emergency management agencies from Michigan to Minnesota operating in a state of controlled, silent panic. The reading could not be explained by any known variable in the Great Lakes hydrologic model. NOAA's algorithms account for evaporation, which averages about 1.88 millimeters per day in early March. They account for the metered outflow through the Soo locks and the St. Mary's River power canals. They account for precipitation, ice coverage, and barometric pressure anomalies. None of these variables, not one, nor any combination of them, could explain where 113 billion gallons had gone. By March 6, secondary monitoring stations at Duluth, Minnesota and Grand Marais confirmed the anomaly. The drop was consistent, it was directional, and most alarmingly, the rate was beginning to accelerate. By March 8, the rate was calculated with enough precision to produce the figures that began to circulate through the USGS and the Army Corps of Engineers, before the word public was ever even whispered. 4.7 million gallons per hour, every hour, around the clock, vanishing. Dr. Raymond Cho, a senior hydrologist with the USGS Great Lakes Science Center in Ann Arbor, reviewed the consolidated data on the morning of March 9th. He didn't write a technical abstract. He didn't call for a committee. He sent an email to his department director with a subject line that contained no scientific jargon. Something is very wrong. The clock had already been ticking for 5 days. The lake was emptying, and for the first time in recorded history, the bedrock of the Midwest was no longer a solid floor, but a sieve. The story of the Great Lakes has always been one of permanence, of a geological basin so stable it was considered the anchor of the North American plate. But on March 10, 2026, that assumption collapsed. While the public was still being told that water level fluctuations were under technical review, a joint emergency task force led by the US Geological Survey and NOAA deployed two high-endurance research vessels, the RV Sturgeon and the RV Key. They weren't looking for a leak, they were looking for a fault line. They expected to find a localized displacement or perhaps a massive sediment slump near the shelf. What they found instead was a hole in the bottom of the world. At exactly 2:43 p.m. on March 11th, the Sturgeon's multi-beam sonar array, scanning a sector 40 miles north of Munising, Michigan, at a depth of 1,300 feet, detected a signal return that defied logic. The lead sonar technician, a USGS contractor named Pete Varga, initially flagged the data as a phantom return, an acoustic shadow caused by thermal layering in the deep water. He requested a second pass, then a third. Each time, the image grew clearer and more impossible. There, at the deepest point of the central basin, was a perfectly circular aperture, 68 feet in diameter. Its walls were not jagged or broken like a tectonic fracture. They were smooth, sculpted, and spiraled with the unmistakable signature of high-velocity fluid erosion. It looked like a drain, Varga later stated in a confidential deposition to the Army Corps of Engineers. Not a geological feature, but a functional architectural element. It looked like someone had pulled a plug that had been seated there for 1 billion years. The sonar pulse penetrated 400 feet into the throat of the tunnel at a 22-degree downward angle before the signal scattered into a void so vast the sensors couldn't find a back wall. This was the Great Drain of Superior. By the time the RV Key reached the site to confirm the coordinates, the atmosphere on the bridge was described as catastrophically quiet. Within 48 hours, expanded mapping identified 7 additional secondary apertures along a 14-mile corridor stretching toward the Apostle Islands of Wisconsin. These weren't just cracks, they were conduits. The largest secondary entrance measured 31 feet across, large enough to swallow a regional freighter whole. This is where the science becomes truly terrifying. To understand what is happening 1,300 feet below the surface, you have to understand karstification. Normally, this is a process reserved for limestone regions like Kentucky or Florida, where acidic groundwater dissolves soft carbonate rock over millennia to create caves. But Lake Superior sits on the mid-continent rift, a 1.1 billion-year-old formation of granite and basalt. Crystalline rock doesn't dissolve. It shouldn't be able to form tunnels. However, the sonar data revealed a geological ghost that had been hidden since the dawn of modern surveying. Beneath the thick layers of volcanic basalt lies a previously unmapped sandwich of ancient, high-purity dolomite and limestone deposited during a marine transgression event 500 million years ago. This layer was trapped, compressed, and invisible to traditional seismic surveys because the heavy igneous rock above it scattered the signals. Dr. Linda Okafor, a lead geomorphologist from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, described it as a buried hydraulic engine. The lake water, naturally slightly acidic from dissolved CO2, has been eating away at this hidden carbonate layer from the inside out for thousands of years. By March 13th, the data showed that this process had reached a critical tipping point. The ceiling of this hidden cave system finally breached the lake floor, and once the seal was broken, the weight of the entire lake, 2.9 quadrillion gallons, became a hydraulic ram. 4.7 million gallons per hour isn't just a flow rate, it's a grinding wheel. The water moving at that pressure is physically enlarging the tunnels every second. GNSS stations positioned on the lake floor by the USGS are already registering crustal sag. The rock is bending under the internal pressure. The implications for US infrastructure are immediate and absolute. the Soo Locks at Sault Marie, Michigan, the single most critical point in the American steel supply chain, rely entirely on the water level of Lake Superior to float 1,000-foot freighters carrying iron ore from the Mesabi Range. If the lake level drops by just 10 inches, those locks become unusable for the largest vessels. We are looking at a total shutdown of the American steel industry within 18 months. In Marquette and Duluth, municipal water intakes are already being monitored for vortexing, the point where the water becomes so shallow that air is sucked into the pumps, cavitating the turbines and leaving hundreds of thousands of Americans without running water. This isn't a slow-motion disaster. It is a structural failure of the North American continent, and the clock is ticking at 78,000 gallons per minute. To grasp the scale of what is happening in the central basin of Lake Superior, geologists are looking to the dark history of American industrial accidents, specifically the 1980 disaster at Lake Peigneur, Louisiana. On November 20th of that year, a 14-inch oil rig drill bit accidentally pierced the ceiling of a salt mine beneath the lake floor. What began as a tiny puncture transformed into a 200-foot-wide swirling maelstrom that swallowed 11 barges, a tugboat, and an entire botanical garden. But Peigneur was a localized event, triggered by human error. What we are witnessing in 2026 is a Peigneur event, occurring at a planetary scale, triggered by the natural structural failure of the North American craton. The science of the Superior Drain relies on a principle called the hydraulic head. Lake Superior sits at an elevation of 602 feet above sea level. For millions of years, the water has been held in place by the impermeable crystalline shield of the mid-continent rift. But the discovery of the unmapped carbonate intrusion layer, the Dolomite Ghost, changes the physics entirely. This layer acts as a pressurized vein. Beneath it lies the Mount Simon Sandstone, a massive, deep-seated regional aquifer that stretches across much of the American Midwest. Under normal conditions, these systems are separated by hundreds of feet of solid rock. But as the tunnel walls dissolve and the hydraulic pressure of 2.9 quadrillion gallons of water hammers against the breached floor, the lake is no longer just a body of water. It has become a gravity-fed piston. By March 15, 2026, data from the USGS National Water Information System began showing a pressure spike in deep observation wells as far south as Rockford, Illinois and Gary, Indiana. The water being lost from Superior is not simply vanishing, it is being forced under immense pressure into the deep crustal voids of the Midwest. This is a coupled system failure. As the water enters the deep sandstone layers, it lubricates ancient dormant fault lines. On March 16th, the National Earthquake Information Center in Golden, Colorado, recorded a magnitude 2.1 tremor centered near Wausau, Wisconsin, a region with virtually zero seismicity. The correlation is 1-to-1. The drainage is triggering induced seismicity across the entire Great Lakes tectonic block. The statistical forecast models being generated at the University of Michigan's Graham Sustainability Institute are bleak. Dr. Warren Lakadir, the man whose 2009 warnings were ignored for nearly 2 decades, provided a simulated transcript of the March 17th briefing to the International Joint Commission. We are observing a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The more water that enters the tunnel, the faster the carbonate dissolves. The faster it dissolves, the more the surrounding basalt loses its structural support. We are not looking at a linear decline. We are looking at an exponential curve of system failure. If the tunnel diameter increases to 100 feet, which our models suggest could happen by July, the flow rate will double. At that point, the St. Mary's River will reverse its flow. Lake Huron will begin to drain upward into Superior to fill the void, creating a chain reaction that will lower water levels across the entire Great Lakes system, from Chicago to Buffalo. This is the Great Lakes Cascade. The 5 sisters, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, contain 21% of the world's surface freshwater. They are a connected hydraulic machine. Superior is the headwater. If the headwater fails, the entire machine seizes. Army Corps of Engineers projections suggest that by October 2026, the dead pool level for the Soo locks will be reached. At that point, the shipping channel that carries 80 million tons of iron ore annually, the raw material for the entire American automotive and construction sectors, will go dry. The economic loss is estimated at $1.2 billion per week. But there is a darker twist in the geological record. Paleolimnologists studying sediment cores from the 1990s have found evidence of unexplained rapid regressions in Superior's history, roughly 8,000 years ago. This suggests that the 2026 drainage might not be a first-time event, but part of a long-wave geological heartbeat, a cyclic draining and refilling of the basin that occurs when the crustal stress reaches a breaking point. The difference this time is that 30 million people now live on the shores of that heartbeat, and their survival depends on a stability that the Earth is no longer willing to provide. The tunnel is not just an accident, it is the reopening of an ancient wound in the continent. For Thomas Bajicki, a fourth-generation commercial fisherman and member of the Fond du Lac band of Lake Superior Chippewa, the disaster didn't arrive as a government notification or a news headline. It arrived as a sudden, jarring thud at 5:14 a.m. on March 14, 2026. Thomas was navigating his 32-foot fishing vessel, the Gichigami, through a stretch of water near the Apostle Islands that he had traversed thousands of times since he was a child. He was in 60 feet of water, according to his 2025 charts. But the Gichigami didn't care about last year's charts. The hull slammed into a rising sandbar that shouldn't have been there, throwing Thomas against the wheelhouse. "The lake feels different," Thomas said in a recorded interview with a local Duluth journalist that was later seized during the initial federal information embargo. "It's not just the depth. The water has this pull, this tension. My grandfather told stories about the great heartbeat of the lake. But this is something else. It feels like the lake is trying to leave." Thomas isn't a scientist, but his nets told the story. By March 16th, his usual catch of lake trout and whitefish had plummeted. The fish, sensitive to the minute changes in pressure and the increasing velocity of the subsurface currents pulling toward the central basin, were migrating away from the traditional spawning grounds. For the Ojibwe bands, whose treaty-protected fishing rights are the backbone of their economy and culture, the draining of Superior isn't just an ecological disaster, it is a cultural erasure. The economic fallout is radiating outward from the shoreline like a shockwave. The port of Duluth Superior is the largest freshwater port in the world by tonnage, moving tens of millions of tons of iron ore, grain, and coal. Every inch of water level drop is a death sentence for the local economy. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimates that for every foot the water level drops, the regional shipping economy loses approximately $160 million in reduced cargo capacity. Freighters like the Paul R. Chugortha, a 1,013-foot Queen of the Lakes, are already being ordered to light load their hulls by 15%, a move that is sending steel prices soaring across the American Midwest. In Ashland, Wisconsin, the crisis is even more intimate. It's coming through the taps. Gerald Hogan, the city engineer for Ashland, has spent 22 years maintaining the municipal water system. On March 16th, he stood before an emergency closed session of the city council. "Our intake pipe is fixed at a specific depth," Hogan explained, his voice captured in a leaked transcript. "We have a buffer, an intake margin, designed to handle seasonal fluctuations. In the last 14 days, that margin has narrowed by 11%. If the lake drops another 36 inches, the pumps will begin sucking air. We have 8,000 residents who rely on this water. There is no backup aquifer. There is no plan B. We never thought we'd need one for Lake Superior." The ecological stakes are equally staggering. The University of Minnesota's Large Lakes Observatory is tracking a thermal cascade. Superior is the world's fastest warming large lake, but the drainage is pulling the cold, nutrient-rich bottom water, the hypolimnion, into the tunnel system at an accelerated rate. This is stripping the lake of its thermal stability. Without that cold water refuge, the Cisco and lake trout populations face a total collapse within 3 seasons. By March 18th, the controlled panic within the federal government could no longer be contained. FEMA has begun prepositioning mobile water treatment units and Blue Dragon high-capacity pumping systems in Duluth and Marquette. The U.S. Department of Transportation has issued an emergency rail freight priority order, anticipating a total shutdown of Great Lakes shipping by the end of the year. The total estimated damage to the U.S. economy, including infrastructure retrofitting, lost shipping revenue, and the collapse of the regional fishing industry, is currently modeled at $42 billion, and that assumes the tunnel doesn't widen. But perhaps the most chilling detail comes from the scientists on the front lines. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the UMD Seismological Lab has been tracking the fracture corridor. The seismic microtremors are no longer just near the tunnel entrance, they are migrating. We are seeing mechanical failure in the rock along a linear path heading towards the Keweenaw Peninsula, she noted in a memo to the governor of Michigan. The hydraulic pressure isn't just moving water, it's moving the earth. We are watching the structural integrity of the American Midwest being compromised in real time, and we are doing it from a front row seat. As of late March 2026, the question being whispered in the corridors of power from Lansing to St. Paul is no longer what is happening, but can it be stopped? If you speak to the engineers at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or the hydrologists at the USGS, off the record, the answer produces the longest, most hollow silences you have ever sat through. There are currently 3 intervention concepts on the table, and each one is more desperate than the last. The first is deep grouting. This involves drilling into the lake floor from specialized platforms and pumping millions of tons of high-pressure cement, liquid rubber, and chemical accelerants directly into the tunnel throat. It is the same technique used to stabilize the Florida coastal sinkholes in 2024, but the conditions beneath Superior are fundamentally different. The tunnel is active. Water is moving at a velocity that exceeds the curing speed of any known industrial grout. In a leaked transcript from a March 19th technical session, one USACE engineer described the attempt as trying to fill a fire hose with wet sand while the valve is open at full pressure. The lake itself is the pump, driven by the inescapable force of gravity. You cannot turn off the lake. The second concept is controlled collapse, a military-grade solution that involves placing shaped charges along the tunnel's limestone ceiling to trigger a localized cave-in, effectively plugging the drain with its own debris. The risks, however, are catastrophic. A detonation of that magnitude at a depth of 1,300 feet could propagate through the already stressed fracture corridor, potentially triggering a massive, uncontrolled collapse of the central lake floor. We aren't talking about a hole, we are talking about a regional sinkhole event that could generate a displacement wave, a freshwater tsunami that would level the waterfronts of Marquette, Michigan and Thunder Bay. The third option, and the one being discussed with the most grim realism, is not a fix at all, but an admission of defeat, systemic adaptation. This involves a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project to reroute water from the Mississippi River Basin or the Hudson Bay watershed into the Great Lakes to compensate for the loss. It is a project on the scale of the Panama Canal, and it would come far too late for the communities currently on the edge. By April 2026, the risks are no longer theoretical, they are physical. Along the Michigan shoreline, the Donald C. Cook nuclear plant and the Palisades power plant rely on massive volumes of Lake Michigan water for cooling. Because the lakes are a coupled system, the drop in Superior is already pulling Lake Michigan's level down through the Straits of Mackinac. If the water level drops below the critical dead pool threshold for these cooling intakes, the NRC will be forced to scram the reactors, de-energizing the manufacturing heart of the United States. We are looking at a regional blackout that could last years while the cooling systems are re-engineered. Dr. Raymond Cho, the USGS lead who first flagged the crisis, addressed the emergency consortium on March 21st. His final assessment was a chilling exercise in scientific honesty. We are currently witnessing a geological process that operates on a timescale we were never prepared to manage, Cho stated. The hydraulic pressure of 2.9 quadrillion gallons is accelerating the hydromechanical erosion of the tunnel walls. The drain rate of 4.7 million gallons per hour is likely the floor, not the ceiling. Our models suggest that by 2027 the rate could triple. He paused, looking at the representatives from FEMA and the White House. We are not in a position to reverse this. We are in a position to watch it happen. Thomas Bajicki went out in the Gichigami again this morning. He didn't cast his nets. He just sat in the middle of the Apostle Islands and watched the water. He says the lake feels hollow now, a vibration in the hull that wasn't there a month ago. In Ashland, Gerald Hogan is overseeing the emergency extension of the city's water intake, a race against a clock that is ticking faster every day. And Dr. Warren Lakader, the man who spent 15 years being ignored, is now the most important scientist in the country. He recently told a colleague, "I spent my entire career hoping I was wrong. I would give every citation, every award, and every cent I have to be proven a fool today. But the data doesn't lie. The lake is living." Here is the reality as of March 22, 2026. The tunnel system is expanding. The seismic network is logging a continuous hum of microtremors as the crust of the Midwest adjusts to the vanishing mass. The water level gauges at Marquette and Duluth continue their steady one-way march downward. Lake Superior has held its shape for 10,000 years, a monument of American freshwater stability. But the Dolomite ghost underneath it has awakened. Maybe this has happened before, in the deep time before humans walked these shores. Maybe the lake has drained and refilled in a cycle we are only now beginning to perceive. But for us, for the 30 million people who depend on this water, the story is just beginning. The numbers are still climbing, the tunnel is still there, and we are still watching. Stay tuned to Natural Disasters as we continue to track the data from the USGS and NOAA. Follow the science, respect the earth, because beneath the surface, the clock is all